Welcome back. Thank you for coming back. As I told you, we're going to be talking about religion and politics, and I am surprised at the turnout. Glad that you're able to be here. We live in a society and a world where I'm just uh, blown away, really, at how little Christians want to talk about politics. And it seems to me, this is just my observation and my opinion, it seems to me that there are, from my perspective, okay, that there are, when we talk about this particular topic, there are two extremes in the church. There are those that have a strong disdain for talking about politics at all. And we try our best, those people at that extreme, they try their best to avoid it at all cost, right? Whatever it takes, I just don't want to talk about it because I don't want to cause friction or whatever it is. And it could very well be well intentioned. And then there's the other extreme where this is all that people want to talk about. And they're so engrossed in political pursuits and ideas, ideology, that they do, in many cases, cause division and rifts. The Christian needs to be somewhere in the middle. Because the Bible does talk about this in a very serious way. And we need to understand what the Bible talks about it. So, how the Bible talks about it. So, we talked this morning, those of you who weren't here, we talked this morning about how God established the family, how God established the church. And we're looking at how God established the government. When we understand that the government, and even the government that we live under, has been established by God, it ought to, whether it does or not, it ought to form a paradigm, a way of thinking in our minds that transcends this world. Okay? When we think about the government, we ought to be thinking about something that is, yes, it's here. We can see it, we can put our hands on it, but it goes beyond that. It goes far beyond the president and November 5th or the election day or whatever. It goes beyond the government. We're going to look extensively, I at least hope, at Romans chapter 13. So we're gonna get started there. And I love when we talk about this topic. This is one of my favorites, one of my favorite passages to turn to when we talk about the government, especially the government as it relates to Christians. Now, let me ask a few obvious questions. Who are we writing to? Who was the book of Romans? Who was it written to? Well, it was written to the church at Rome. Let me ask another dumb question. Who was in charge of Rome? Well, Caesar, the emperor, right? Let me ask another silly question. Were they good? Did they love Christians? That would be a big fat no. Absolutely not. I don't know if there is in all of history, I don't know if there are people that hated, perhaps with the exception of Artaxerxes, that hated God's people more than the Roman government. With that in mind, let's read Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Let every person, let's stop there. Who's he talking to? Well, I believe that would include all of us, wouldn't it? especially those who are in Rome, by extension, us, if we think the Scripture is given for us and for our instruction, as we believe it is. Let every person, therefore, be subject to the governing authorities. Stop there. Is there any question as to what it means? For there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those that resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed. We don't like this verse very much, do we? But nonetheless, it's there. Pay to all what is owed, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. I have heard so many comments today and throughout the 10 years. I'm really glad that you're talking about politics. Why is anybody surprised? If it's in the Bible, why do we shy away from it? I'm not going to stand up here and I'm not going to tell you that if you are a Republican, then you need to watch out. Because the Republican Party stands for things that are not okay with God. And I'm not going to stand up here and say, if you are a Democrat and you voted Democrat, that you need to watch out. Because the Democratic Party stands for things that are not okay with God. Quite frankly, I think there are very few people in politics that are right with the Lord. So we all need to watch out. But with this thought, there's a repeated theme, if you've paid attention, 2 times in verse 1 and again in verse 5. Subjection. We talked about what is our responsibility when we are a part of the established church of God. What is our responsibility? Well, it's to fulfill our role. What is our responsibility as we are a part of God's established family and our family unit? What is our role? Well, it is to do your job. Whatever your job is, you are to do your job as God has commanded. What is your role as a part of and serving under this government? 2 times your responsibility is to be in subjection. Let me tell you what that doesn't look like. It does not look like a sign in my front yard that says, "Not my president." It does not look like me carrying a flamethrower and torching, or carrying a gun and holding someone at point blank range because they don't agree with me. That's not what he's writing about. When he says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Therefore, one must, in verse 5, be in subjection. He's not writing to a people that are serving and are under great and gracious people. He's writing to one of the most detestable ruling authorities that has ever ruled on earth. And he still says, let every person be subject to the governing authority. Now, throughout and before you crucify me, consider this. Throughout history, there is a line that is drawn. And you see it over and over and over again, where the authority, the government stands, and the government has made a decree that this should happen, and the people of God refuse. We're looking at three examples of people who have resisted the government. The first one that we're looking at is in Exodus chapter 1, or Exodus chapter 2, rather. We were introduced, and we know her name to be Jochebed, according to Exodus chapter 6, and I believe around verse 20. The decree, if you remember here in Exodus chapter 1, as the people of Israel began to grow exponentially, the Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, gave the command that all these babies, all these little innocent baby boys born to the Hebrews, need to be thrown into the Nile River. That was the decree. Two brave midwives by the name of Shiphrah and Puah did not follow that decree. There's also the story that we're giving our attention to. Someone who, I guess, did, but then again did not follow the decree. Now a man from the house of Levi, Exodus chapter 2, verse 1, now a man from the house of Levi went and took his wife, a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made with bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She hid the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank, the river Nile. Did she obey the commands? Well, she did put her son in the Nile River. That was the command. I don't think she did what was intended, though. Was she wrong in disobeying the government? Turn your attention to one more. The first book of the minor prophets is Daniel. And there are quite a few stories in Daniel alone about people who resisted government. But we're looking at Daniel chapter 3. Now, you remember in Daniel chapter 3, this decree was given by King Nebuchadnezzar that he had spent an immense amount of time, effort, and money to build this 90-foot tall statue. And this thing was 9 feet in breadth. Just to put a little perspective, taller than the building. And if you put I'm guessing these are about 8-foot sheets of paneling around the wall. So you add another foot. This is how wide in breadth this thing was. This incredibly grotesque display of someone who is so ostentatious. He built this huge statue for himself. And the decree was given whenever, as he gathered all the people, whenever you hear all these instruments, everyone is to fall down, bow down, and worship this image. Well, of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow down. And you remember, some Chaldeans came and told Nebuchadnezzar, maliciously, the ESV says, that these Jews did not bow down. So he orders them to come. They stand before the king, and we arrive at verse 16, where it says this: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, that you will throw me into the fiery furnace, if this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. I am always fascinated by this. As you read it, it gives you chills every time. I'm always fascinated by this. I'll tell you what they didn't do, and maybe that'll help us understand what they did do. They didn't go to the king and say, you know what, king? This is horrible, terrible, and you are a bad, bad man, and we will not do this. They did not make a big scene. Nor did they go to the king and say, you know what, you are not a real king, because a real king wouldn't make his subjects do something like this. In fact, they replied to him, O king, O king. Still giving him honor. Just like Jochebed, they quietly and humbly resisted. One more. In the book of Acts. For those who would say, well, that's all in the Old Testament. The book of Acts. You remember the book of Acts? We find ourselves in Acts chapter 4. And here in this particular context, in Acts chapter 5, Peter and John have already been detained overnight. They've already been arrested. And they've already been charged, you don't speak anymore in the name of Jesus. Otherwise, there will be consequences. And the miracles continue to happen. The authorities come to Peter, James, or Peter and John, and it says this is one of the greatest statements in the whole Bible. It says this about the power of God, verse 15. Not the power of Peter, the power of God. So that they even carried the sick into the streets and laid them on cots and mats, that as Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on some of them. Ooh, that'll give you chills. But it's in that context. The high priest and those who were with him, the Sadducees and many of the Pharisees came, and they arrested Peter and John. And it says, as they put them in prison, that the prison doors were open. The angel led them out and commanded them to keep speaking. So the next morning, verse 27, they were brought before the council, and they said, we strictly charge you not to teach in this name. Yet you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. Interesting side note. Isn't that exactly what they said would happen at the crucifixion? This man's blood be on us and our children. And you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But look at what it says in verse 29. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. Jochebed, Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego, Peter, John, quietly, humbly resisted the decree of the government. I say all those to say you arrive at a paradox when you consider these three examples and you consider the text of Romans chapter 13 and verses 1 through 7. You arrive at a paradox that is, should we resist the government or should we be in subjection to the government? Wouldn't it be nice if everything in life was black and white? Well, the answer to that question is yes. Yeah. You should resist the government, and you should also be in subjection to the government. You should be in subjection to the government all the time until the government crosses the line into your moral, God-given standards. When the government commands Jochebed, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Peter, John, when they command them to do things that God has told them to do or told them not to do, no longer can you obey the government because you serve a higher king, one whose rules and government is superior to all. Let's go back to Romans chapter 13. Humor me for a minute. As we read this again, I want you to circle or highlight or at least count how many times God is mentioned. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of those of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. And if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of your conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. If you are counting, if you've circled, there should be about 8. You see in verse 1, you see it in verse 1 twice, you see it in verse 2, you see it in verse 4, in verse 5, you see it in verse 6. You see it as this chapter bleeds. God, 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 God. Now, as you see God, 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 God through this whole text, go back and analyze them one more time because you're going to see it in verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Look at verse 2. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. See it in verse 4. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God. an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. As you go back and look and analyze those 8, you're going to see at least 4 times where it says in this text that God is in control. These authorities, this government, is from God. It is that they are appointed by God. John, you mean to tell me that, fill in the blank, the worst man that's ever been, the worst woman that has ever been, is there by God? I believe so. And I believe that history bears out that even when there are horrible, terrible, and wicked men ruling God's people, that God is still in control. So when we come back to our question, right, that we had this morning, our question right now, here is what is my responsibility when I see the government? Well, we've already said one, is to be in subjection. So far as we can, to be in subjection. What is my responsibility? If I read Romans chapter 13, my responsibility is to trust that God is still in control. To trust and to know that God is more powerful. I don't know which way you voted. I don't know if you even voted. And quite frankly, it doesn't mean a hill of beans to me. You know why? Because my God is greater than any election. My God is greater than any president or authority that has ever ruled. I want to end with this verse that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately in Hebrews chapter 11. These all died in faith, verse 13, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. We are seeking a homeland, and it is not the United States of America, nor any other government. I desperately want to be a stranger, an exile, an alien in this land. And I want my home to be elsewhere, to be with God.